her mouth once again sent my head spinning off into space, and my world into complete chaos.
Zachary's not dead.
I stopped breathing for a moment. When I caught my breath, I asked her to repeat that again. She did. Except this time, she added the fact that his life had been in danger, so he had to hide from me, and Jacob just had to think that he was dead. I could literally feel my brain dripping out from my ears as my mind turned into mush with every word out of her mouth. Then for the real kicker to my drunken meltdown, Zachary got on the phone. Sure enough, it was his voice. He apologized for what he had had to do. I apologized for what I was about to do, which was scream and yell my lungs out, throw my phone into a wall, smashing it into a million pieces, and then proceed to go from being super hammered drunk to completely shithoused wasted. I drank everything that wasn't nailed down. Who knows what other drugs I did on top of that, because I sure don't remember. I was literally having a complete and total mental breakdown. The last strand of my sanity in my brain just snapped. I did this for a couple more hours until I somehow drove back home, put on my work clothes, and tore out of the parking lot to go to my job in a city half an hour down the interstate, with people chasing me, trying to stop me. I don't recall any of what happened next, but apparently this is what I did. I showed up to work completely wasted and got fired from a damn good job. I called my father, freaking out in the parking lot of said job. He realized I was drunk and told me to stay there and he would come to get me. Oh, how I wish crazy drunk me would have listened. Instead of doing that, I started driving on the interstate again, not caring if I lived or died, and obviously not caring about anyone else. According to the police report, I was tearing down the interstate at 130 miles per hour. I apparently hit 2 mile markers on the side of the road and blew both my right-hand tires, but continued on driving with sparks shooting 50 feet out of the back of my car. I took the exit to the hospital going that fast and spun out, completely totaling what was left of my car. According to bystanders, I then proceeded to exit my vehicle and run across the damn interstate towards the hospital, with people chasing after me. Once I got to the ER doors, I now heard the familiar police cruiser. I was so arrested for driving under the influence. I blew a 2.0 about 12 hours after I had my last drink. If I had blown a 2.1, I would have gotten a felony charge. That led to years of failed drug tests, violated probations, and ultimately a year in jail down the line. After that, I decided enough was enough. These crazy people from Maryland and their insane concept of living could all go to hell as far as I was concerned. It had been nearly 2 years of torment, fear, and unimaginable pain. Worst of all, it was starting to cost me my mind and my freedom. I was done listening to Josie and ready to start listening to my actual friends in town who had been begging me to stay away from these people for a long time now. Some good friends set me down and started to tell me the inconsistencies in all their stories over the last few years. At first, I didn't want to listen, but then, eventually, there was just too much evidence not to listen. Finally, I opened my ears and my mind to what was really going on. I decided to figure this out once and for all. I got on MySpace, Facebook, and every other social media I could think of. I typed in Josie's full name into the search bar of every single one. What I found, to this day, still makes my stomach turn inside out. There, on every social media possible, by using her name and the few email addresses I knew she had, I found dozens and dozens of accounts linked to her emails. Duplicate after duplicate of Zachary's full name on accounts with pictures of her, and the same with Jacob and every single solitary other person in the supposed elites. That's when it finally, after years of denial and torment, it finally freaking hit me like a railroad car full of bricks. Holy shit, she's every single one of these people. She absolutely and unequivocally made up every single solitary one of these people, and has been pretending to be a dozen or more people for over 2 years. As you can imagine, my jaw damn hit the floor. Thank God I had some close friends who had been keeping me from falling apart, and helped me to find every single fake profile she had ever created. I was dumbfounded. Profile after profile after profile that had her pictures, but the names of people that I thought were entirely real. Prototype accounts before she ended up making the actual fake accounts. Gags or jokes to her, really. In fact, all of this had been one big, insane, psychotic joke. I was too shocked to be enraged yet, but don't worry, that's coming. I diligently copied every link to every single one of her profiles into my AOL Messenger. Then I called her. Hey, how are you?
I'm alright, I guess. Just bored. You?
Nope, definitely not bored over here. Get on AimChat and I'll show you something really interesting. I was nearly hysterical at that point, and I could tell that she knew something was up. Once she was online, I simply asked her, "Hey Josie, what are these?" Then sent her the link to every single fake profile she had ever created in her miserable life, and a few from email accounts I didn't even know belonged to her. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening as I heard her clicking through link after link. Her 2-year-long mental game was over, and she finally realized it. Her words,
Well, fuck, man. Guess you got me.
She then started to laugh, genuinely laugh as though something remotely funny had just occurred. I don't recall what I said, but apparently it was bad enough for my friends to take away the phone and have to hold me down. Catfish, the show or the movie, wasn't around way back then, so I had unwittingly become one of the first hardcore victims of a stalker in the internet age. Worse than that, I had talked, lived with, and even befriended the girl who had been stalking and trying to ruin my life for 2 years. It was literally, and still is, the single biggest mindfuck I've ever had in my entire life. Thousands upon thousands of messenger conversations, hundreds and hundreds of hours of phone conversation, countless amounts of cash being spent to drive up several states away, just to stay with my psycho stalker every single time, even bringing her down to live with me for months, having $5,000 mysteriously vanish out of my bank account. Everything was starting to make sense. There was no Jacob, there was no Zachary, there was no gang. What there actually was one completely batshit insane girl with more mental problems than could fit in an encyclopedia. She was one of the only people I ever talked to. She was the only person I ever saw. And even worse, she was the one that paid Sean to come to my house with a gun and try to kill my entire family. Josie was the only person in these last 2 years that had orchestrated any of this. From all of the fake kidnappings and boyfriend drama, to faking the death of someone I had fallen in love with and bringing him back just to screw with my head. Who the hell does that? All the events of the last 2 years came flooding into my mind as I realized in each and every one, it was solely her and no one else but her. So many questions raced through my head, the least of which being why me? I deleted my MySpace and made my Facebook private. I only accept friends that I knew are real. I felt completely off the wagon and out of my head. Drugs, alcohol, and more drugs. That's all that I could do to cope. Here I was, a gay man that had unknowingly fallen in love with a straight woman, and regardless of whether or not I thought it was a gay man, that shit still fucks with you in the head pretty bad. I didn't think I could ever be close to someone again. My whole world had been rocked and ruined. To this day, all these years later, I still don't trust people. I don't think I'll ever be able to trust someone ever again. Can you blame me? She came down here. Yeah, you heard me right. That bitch moved into my sister's town, not even half an hour away from me. I bumped into her by accident. We started talking. Again, as much as I wanted to stomp her into a bloody pulp on the ground, you catch more flies with honey. I wanted answers. Hell, I deserved them. I told her that I was trying to forgive her and I needed answers to my questions in order to do so. I asked her if she would sit down with me and tell me everything. She reluctantly agreed. I politely informed her that this forgiveness was not for her. It was for me, so I could stop holding on to and living in the past. I explained that she nearly killed me, ruined my life. What she did was the most personal and horrific thing one human being can do to another. Especially after I was so damn good to her. She was polite and let me get what I needed to get off of my chest. I tried to be calm and not rude so she wouldn't run away. I did get closure somewhat and answers to everything. Here's her explanation. Take it with a grain of salt. It started out as a joke when she was in high school. There was a girl who was being mean to her and bullying her, so she thought she'd get her back by getting her to like a guy online and reveal the awful truth later. She had made a bunch of prototype profiles, and eventually almost 20 profiles in total, so it looked like this group of people had the same friends, and they were real. She just pulled off pictures off of freaking Google. She knew none of these people in real life. She was having a good old time tricking this girl, when along comes a spider to mess up her web. Me. She said she thought that she would just mess with me a bit, and let me know that she was actually a girl. But after talking to me, she unintentionally fell in love with me. Whether that's true or not, I don't know what to believe. If she really did love me, then why put me through pure freaking hell for 2 years? She said she wanted to tell me a million times, but it just got out of control. Before she knew it, she was really getting into being these people, and somewhat believed she was them and that they were real. Again, this chick is the world's best bullshitter I've ever met, so who knows what the truth really is. All I wanted to know was how did she get the music, and how did she sound like a guy on the phone? The music, as she shockingly demonstrated to me, was actually hers. She's an amazing pianist and guitar player. I saw this with my own eyes and heard it with my own ears. Zachary's voice on the phone wasn't very complicated. She paid a guy friend a few bucks to be in on it, which this jerk-off eagerly agreed to. Ruining someone's life for a few bucks. How sweet. Sean was all her. She paid him $500 to do that. She had zero explanation as to why. She knew that he would do it. He's just as much as a psycho as she is. The rest of it was pure fantasy and imagination, all dolled up to be extra crazy so I could care more about Zachary and give her more attention. As lie after lie was finally revealed and the truth brought to life, I had heard enough after around 8 hours of this. I had heard everything I really needed to hear and wanted to. My life was nearly destroyed, my family nearly killed, my mental and emotional health left scarred forever, never simply because she wasn't getting enough attention in her life. Neither was I when all of that started, but I didn't go about like a human wrecking ball trying to make myself feel better. I'll never be able to comprehend or understand the mind of someone like that. People who derive pleasure from other people's pain and misery. I'll never be able to fully trust, not in the way that's required of a true partner and companion. I just can't do that again. If I'm mortally betrayed again, I know the next time it will kill me. So as I share this in my apartment, a little over a decade after it all happened, I'm alone. One good thing did come from this though. It sure as hell made me the person that I am today. It strengthened and toughened my resolve into tempered steel. I learned to be okay with myself, and to finally love myself after so many years of self-loathing. I'm a pretty amazing person. I don't need a man to define my life and who I am in any shape, form, or fashion. Obviously, I'm worth something. Otherwise, this psycho chick wouldn't have latched onto me for years, and ended up moving 8 hours away from her home to be 30 minutes away from me all this damn time. What she stole, I'll never get back. What I gained, she can never take away from me again.
Yeah.
Back in December of 2007, when I was 17, my mum, my sister Andre, and our cat Whiskers had all moved to Staten Island into a 4-bedroom and 1-bath house. We couldn't afford to buy a house, and ended up finding one that was up for rent for a pretty reasonable price. Staten Island is also known as the Forgotten Borough, and is also considered the most suburban part of New York City. My mum had always wanted to live in a house, especially in Staten Island, since most of our family had already lived there. The street we lived in was really quiet and decent looking, and was also a dead-end street. All the houses had their own unique styles, and you could tell that they had been there for quite some time. There was one house in particular on the street that looked really strange and abandoned. The house did not look like the usual houses in the neighborhood. Some of the windows were boarded up, and the other had broken and dirty white blinds on them. The paint on the side of the house was tearing off, but you could tell that the house was once a baby blue color. The front of the house looked like a tornado had went through it, and the grass looked like it hadn't been cut in years. Needless to say, there were also 2 abandoned cars in it, one of which was a 1961 black Chevy Impala that sat in the driveway of the house, and the other was a 1959 red Cadillac that sat in the tall grass in the backyard of the house. We just thought that the house was abandoned and that the people had left years ago. We all had hoped that someday someone would clean up the property, renovate and sell it. I was also fascinated with the house though. I wondered if it was haunted, had anyone died recently or years ago there, what valuables were left behind. I would often try and go and peek through the broken blinds, but saw nothing but darkness, even in the daytime. It wasn't until one of these moments when I saw a light flick from the upstairs attic in that house one late night. I was a huge fan of horror movies, and felt like, at that moment, that I may have seen one too many or something. I was up doing a late assignment while watching movies and must have been tired, so I thought. I peeked through the blinds of my window, and it was still on. I ran into my mother's room and told her about the light, but by the time she had gotten up, the light had turned off. She went outside and searched around outside, but found nothing. But I saw something as she came back into the house. There was an old Volkswagen pulling up to the side of the abandoned house with the headlights on. A family with a husband, wife, and 3 kids got out. The 3 kids were older girls. One was a teenager, the other looked to be preteen, and the youngest had to be about 7 or 8 years old. They dressed differently, like they were from a different time period or something. I just thought maybe they were just religious and didn't believe in certain stuff or something. They all looked disorientated and dazed, but it was also 1 in the morning. They never said a word. They just went into this abandoned house, and for the first time in 3 months, the lights all came on, but went off in seconds. My mother stood there in shock and could not believe that these people lived in that house. Maybe it's nice on the inside, my mother said as she shrugged her shoulders and went back to bed. At this point, I was even more fascinated. We had never seen these people, ever. And obviously, they would come out mostly in the nighttime and rarely in the daytime. I used to wonder if the kids were homeschooled, or maybe attending boarding school and coming home once in a while. Whatever it was, they were pretty creepy and weird. My mother, sister, and I started nicknaming them the Addams family, and calling their house the Addams family house because it looked exactly like the structure of the house they showed on the TV. And those people were weird. We never knew their names, and even the kids never said anything, and you would think that they would be the most interactive ones. But no, they were just really quiet, and things just got creepier. One day, I noticed a foul odor coming from somewhere. We couldn't find it, but it smelt like death, like an animal had died. My mother opened one of the windows in the house and was shocked to see a swarm of huge flies flying around the basement window of the house next door. When you looked at it, you could see the flies on the inside of the house, as well as on the outside. It really creeped us out. We didn't call the police, but we were really scared. When my uncle came over for a visit later on that day, we told him about the incident. Now, my uncle is a skilled hunter and survivalist, and he went around to the neighbor's house, and the smell was so horrid that even he threw up. We ended up calling the police, but by that time, the smell and the flies were already gone by the time they showed up, and so there wasn't anything that they could do. One night, the day before Thanksgiving, my mother and I were preparing some food for the next day. My mother likes to get a head start on the cooking. We were expecting a good amount of people this time. Aunts, cousins, uncles, and older siblings. My cat Whispers suddenly let out a yawl and began scratching at the door to let him in. Once I opened the door, he jumped into my arms and wouldn't let me put him down. I held him as I peeked through the blinds to see what had spooked him, only to see a man dressed in dark clothing that seemed to be staring back at me. He then turned his back towards me and faced the house. I told my mother what had happened, and she told me not to worry and that the whole family was creepy and needed help. My cat let out another yawl and then started meowing uncontrollably and still did not want me to put him down. When I looked towards the window, I noticed orange flames in our window. Is that a fire?
Mum, I think there's a fire outside.
My sister, mother, and I, with my cat in my arms, ran outside. The next-door neighbour's house was on fire. It was engulfed with flames, and now it was on our windows. And the man I saw just stood there with no remorse as his entire home burned. As his home burned, his face glistened along with the fire and the moonlight as he looked back at me with dark, hazy eyes. I will never forget that look as long as I live. The police and fire trucks got there just in time and were able to put out the fire, but the house was really badly burnt. To my surprise and my mum's relief, the fire only touched our windows and didn't do much damage to our house. But within the moments of us looking at the house and the police coming, the man had suddenly disappeared without a trace or sound. The cops weren't able to catch him and continuously sent patrol cars to watch over the house. They asked the neighborhood questions about the people that lived there. The crazy thing was that no one knew who they were, how long they lived there, and where they might have gone. It was just a total mystery. That family had suddenly vanished without a trace. I also found out through an older lady that lived in the neighborhood since the 1950s that a family had once died in that house in a fire back in 1963, and the family had 3 daughters. And can you believe it? One was a teenager, the other was a preteen, and the youngest was about 7 or 8 years old. She said that the father was a very sinister and overzealous man who controlled his wife and family. She also said that even though the fire was ruled accidental, she had no doubt in her mind that the father was the one who set it off in the first place. Eventually, the cops grew tired and stopped coming around. They had no leads and no one was coming forward. And the house laid vacant, just the way it was when we first moved next door. After a few quiet months, my mother decided to move the family again this time to a house that she bought just on the other side of Staten Island. As we were leaving the house that night, during the late summer of 2009, and packing the rest of our things into the U-Haul, I could not help but look at the abandoned house just once more. And as soon as we drove away, the light in the attic of that home flicked on again. It was summer, I believe the day after the 4th of July, and my husband and I were in the middle of a crossroad country trip. We were driving through Texas, and for any of you who have driven across the entire state of Texas, you know that it is a very long and very barren drive. Sometimes we'd go hours without seeing anything at all, and the towns we did pass through didn't consist of much more than a rusty old gas station and a few dusty little houses. Looking out the window, you would swear that you were just driving through the same 5 miles of desert again and again. I had started getting a headache, and my husband suggested that I take a quick nap to get rid of it. I remember allowing myself to doze off as I watched the beautiful colors of a desert sunset. The slowing of the car woke me up, and the first thing I noticed was how dark it was. I believe that it was around 10 p.m. My husband had stopped at a gas station with a small shop. He told me he was going to grab us some food and asked if I needed to pee. Knowing I might not have another chance for quite a while, I went into the shop to use the restroom. Both the men's and the women's restrooms were down a little hall from the open area of the shop. I was groggy and tired and realized how badly I needed to pee, so I shuffled into the restroom. As I made my way through the short distance from the door to the nearest of the 2 stalls, I made eye contact with a woman coming out of the only other stall. She didn't quite look homeless, but she was definitely messy looking. She had wild grey hair, almost shoulder length if it hadn't been sticking out every direction from her head. It looked like it hadn't been brushed in weeks. She was wearing ragged looking clothing, a pair of ill-fitted black workout shorts, and I remember noting her foam flip-flops. There were several layers on top, one of them being a large purple and green coat. Keep in mind that this is Texas in July. The jacket was just hanging on her shoulder, crooked like she hadn't bothered to take a few more seconds to put it on correctly. She was also carrying something in a tied-up plastic grocery bag. I gave a quick smile as our eyes met, and she just stared at me in return. Then her face turned wild and intense looking. Her eyebrows were set as if she was angry, but her eyes had a wild, alive look. She looked at me like she was hungry, and this is when I felt the first tinge of something was wrong. I just tried to brush it off though. She waddled over to the only sink, and I took my time shutting the stall door because something about her posture in front of the mirror struck me as odd, and I was trying to figure it out. She was standing with her body more angled toward me, but her face was turned to the mirror. Her body was tensed, legs slightly crouched as if she was ready to act or something. Her hands were not by her face or trying to fix a mess of hair or even being washed. They were at her sides, elbows also slightly bent. I wasn't sure why, but I suddenly felt uncomfortable. I regretted leaving my purse and cell phone behind. I shut and locked the stall door and took my time using the toilet. I wanted her gone before I felt the safety of the stall. I stayed there long after I had finished, but the woman was still there, so I waited longer. Finally, I heard the smacking of her flip-flops as she made her way to the door. I heard it open and then slammed closed. The door was pretty heavy and had slammed the same way when I had entered. I stayed for a moment and allowed the wave of relief to wash over me before I reached for the lock, and then paused, fingers only an inch from the lock. I stayed as silent as I could manage to confirm what I had just thought I heard. It was breathing. The woman had only pretended to leave. At this point, I was scared and confused. Why had she tried to trick me into thinking that she had left, only to stick around and be as quiet as possible? I knew something was very wrong, so I stayed in the stall even longer, and this time it must have been at least 20 minutes, but I had no way of knowing for sure. I could tell from the direction her breathing was coming from that she had positioned herself in the far corner, right next to the door, but far enough that I couldn't see her feet. Finally, I heard her leave. This time, I waited a few minutes to make sure that she hadn't tried a trick again. I slipped out of the stall, quickly washed my hands, and rushed down the hallway to the store. It was pitch black outside, and I had no idea where she was, but I knew that she couldn't be far. A large man was checking out at the register, so I waited near a window display until he left the store and quietly slipped out of the door behind him. And sure enough, crouched right outside of the front door is the woman. She seemed surprised as she stood and turned away, walking quickly around the side of the store. My husband was waiting in the car and asked me if I was okay since I had taken so much longer than usual, and I said I would tell him all about it once we were away from that store. Other people who have heard my story have had many theories, but the two most common were that she was a druggie that wanted to mug me, or that she worked with sex trafficking or something. I'm open to any of your theories and would like to hear some suggestions. I tried to see if there was anything in the news from around that time, but I couldn't figure out exactly where we were when this happened. This story is about my mum. She's been living in the same house for about 12 years now. It's in a shady neighborhood, lots of gang activity, and sirens can always be heard not far away. I can't count the number of times the convenience store across the street has been robbed since we moved in. But we were never really concerned, as my mother created an unquestionably comfortable home, and I always felt safe. In 2013, when my father died, she adopted a dog for company, as it was just her living in the house at the time when this incident occurred. The dog is Yappy, sweet as hell, but any sort of noise outside, whether it's a car door slamming or our mailman, she will bark, and bark, and bark, and bark. This can be scary if it catches you off guard, or if it's late at night, but of course, it's also reassuring that she is so alert, and that is exactly what happened. My mother told me that it was late one night, maybe 2 a.m. She was getting ready for bed. She stays up late watching Investigative Discovery and the like. There are 2 doors that must be open to get inside the house. The front door has a large window and opens into a porch where she keeps her deep freezer. There is a larger metal door after the porch, which opens directly into the living room of her house. She locks it every night before she goes to bed. She likes to sleep on the couch in the living room. She claims her bed upstairs hurts her back. So, one night, all of a sudden her dog started barking her head off. At first, my mum scolded her, assuming that she had heard a car pass by or something. But then, my mum heard it too. Someone was knocking on the front door. The doors had muffled the sound of the knock, but it was someone knocking. My mum sat there silently contemplating what to do, and hoping whoever it was would just go away. But it persisted, as her dog did. Now, my mother wasn't born yesterday. She's a tough old bird and won't take anyone's shit. She opened the metal door and went to the window. Lifting the blinds, she saw a disheveled girl standing on the front step. My mum thought that she was perhaps drunk, as she was unsteady on her feet and slurred when she spoke. My mum asked what she wanted. "Is Danielle here?" the woman asked. No. There's no one here by that name, sorry." My mum responded politely as she dropped the blinds and was about to go back into the house. But then, the woman started pounding on the door this time, with force. Lots of force, in fact. My mum thought that she had been kicking it.
Let me in!
She screamed. At this point, my mum was irked. She goes back to the front door, lifts the blind again, and adamantly tells this woman to fuck off, that there's no one there named Danielle. This woman finally left, but it wasn't until the next day that my mum realised the trouble she could have been in if she had opened the door that night. Her front yard is surrounded by a short metal fence, about waist high. She gives us hell any time that we forget to close the gate. And when she was retrieving the morning paper, she noticed this woman had left the gate open. Annoyed again, she put on her slippers to go outside to close it. And that's when she saw it. Laying on the ground beside our walkway was a crowbar. My mum then understood what the force was that was used to pound on the front door. She had no idea that the woman was holding it. The window itself can see a person on the other side from about chest up, and it had been dark. Who knows what could have happened if my mother decided to open the door that night. This memory of mine begins about 3 years ago when I graduated high school. I had grown up with my grandparents, but decided to move to a different and much larger city to live with my dad for the first time in 12 years. I somewhat knew the city already because I spent my summers with him, but this would be the first time I would have the freedom of an adult. To come and go as I pleased, drive my car anywhere, smoke cigarettes whenever I wanted. I was really excited, though sad to leave all of my friends. As soon as I was settled in, my dad and stepmom sat me down to discuss the few rules and what I needed to know about the complex. Basic things like, go wherever you want, but let us know when you leave and when you're coming back, even if it's 2 AM. Oh, and you'll have to park on the street because the apartment complex has limited parking. One more thing. There's this neighborhood creep. This guy, George, was well known to all the women in the complex, as well as the police that patrolled the area. He was tall and fairly huge, very intimidating looking. My parents were pretty certain that he would leave me alone for one reason, my dad. Though George had a habit of stalking other women in the complex, he would stop and find a new target if they had a man to make a show of being in their place. It could have been a brother, a lover, or a father. It didn't matter what he was to the woman or what he looked like. George would just simply back off immediately. Since I lived with my dad, who is also quite tall and rather big, or intimidating, I felt confident that I would be alright. And I was, for a time. It started about 6 months after I moved in. My stepmom and dad were fighting a lot more, until she got up and left him. One night I was sitting on my porch having a cigarette and browsing Facebook or whatever. I wish I could say that I felt like I was being watched, but I probably just looked up because I felt a bug or something. George was standing about 15 feet away, a little bit behind a tree, just staring intently at me. I nearly dropped my cigarette, and shakily, I stubbed it out and just went inside. I was home alone, so I made sure to lock all of my doors and then played a video game in my room. I told myself that I was probably just paranoid. The next morning, I got up for my morning cigarette and coffee, and lo and behold, minutes after I got onto my porch, George came ambling out of his apartment to look my way. I sucked down my cigarette and went back inside. This pattern continued for a couple of weeks. It was like George stood at his sliding glass door, peeking out, waiting to see when I would pop out. I told my dad about it, and he tried to sit with me whenever I went to smoke. If he came with me, George wouldn't even peep a head out of his door. Of course, the other women in the complex had already tried to call the police about George. But he lives in the complex, and staring isn't a crime. So there wasn't much that they could do. I didn't know how far George had taken it with other women before, and with that info in my mind, I knew that calling wouldn't be much use. Things slowly escalated. Once my stepmom left, I had access to a parking spot, so I had 3 ways to get from my car to my apartment, depending on how I parked. One of the ways went just past George's apartment, about 5 feet from his door. Since I got off work late most nights, I avoided that route as much as possible. Slowly but surely, like he memorized my schedule, he would be on one of those paths when I was coming home. Not directly on the concrete, but a few feet away on the grass, behind a tree. It was like he thought that I couldn't see him. I mean, picture a child hiding very terribly behind a tree. You can see 90% of their body, and you know that they're there. That's what he would do. I would rush past him, avoid eye contact, but prepare to scream if I heard him coming after me. I started to carry my keys between my fingertips. I bought a pocket knife and I would walk from my car with it halfway open already, even though I've never been in any kind of fight in my life. Around this time, I believe, my mum was trying to find me some free self-defense classes, since I couldn't afford anything on my tight budget. My dad was steadily getting more and more pissed off as George edged closer and closer, escalating as the days went by. It went from November all the way to May. If my dad wasn't home, I would lock my bedroom door and keep my knife under my pillow. I would Skype all night with my boyfriend, just so someone could call 911 for me if they needed to. I even put a bunch of flower pots in front of my bedroom window so no one could get in silently. I started sitting on the floor of my porch below the wall, out of sight to smoke, but angled so I could see him if he walked up to it. I had terrible nightmares too. Then one day, my neighbor, Shell, was gossiping to me. "Did you hear about George?" No. He got arrested last night. In the complex parking lot, there's a sort of big electrical power box. It stands about waist height and is perhaps 2 or 3 feet wide. About 10 minutes before I was supposed to come home and park right in front of it, some lady with her kid walking by saw George sitting on the box, masturbating. Was he waiting there for me? Jerking off to the thought of me seeing him there? Ugh, the thought of it makes me want to puke and scares me all at the same time. I was relieved for a few days of my stress, but it was only a few days that he was gone. Then he was back, and he went right back to the same old routine. One night though, he got far braver. It was maybe 7 p.m. when I went out for a cigarette with my dad. The neighbor walked up to chat with my dad, and George came outside and stood out in the open, staring me down. "That dude's asking to get his fucking ass kicked," my dad said under his breath. Then he chatted to the neighbor some more. I rolled my eyes, went inside and played some more video games. I was healing in a World of Warcraft dungeon when I heard Shell shouting.
"Where are you?"
But I was healing, a pretty important job, and I figured that she was just talking to someone else. That is, until she burst into my room in a panic, her eyes huge. She hopped from foot to foot frantically like she was doing the potty dance or something. "He's bleeding!" "Who?" I asked in bewilderment. "Your dad! Come quick!" I made some teenager huffing sound and left my computer, certainly pissing off the rest of the group. I grabbed our little first aid kit filled with band-aids. I thought in my mind that my dad was doing something stupid, like tossing up his pocket knife and trying to catch it or something. But when I stepped outside, I found myself face to face with a real horror. About 6 people surrounded my dad, including Shell, and my neighbor Caleb held a shirt to my dad's side. He was facing away from me, and his entire back was just covered in blood. It looked like he'd been mauled by a bear or something. That was seriously my first thought. Caleb's hold on the shirt slipped, and blood sprayed everywhere. I feel queasy even writing this down. I have never in my life been the person people turn to in an emergency. I mean, blood makes me lightheaded, and I have anxiety attacks over not being able to find a specific bookmark. But all of the adults, people around 30 or 40, while I was just 18, around me were panicked, aside from Caleb. I needed to be the person that people turn to. I threw the first aid kit onto the porch and told Shell where we keep our towels. She rushed to go and grab one. "Has anyone called 911? I shouted. 5 pairs of eyes turned to look at me like they'd never heard of 911 before. "No," my dad said. "I can't afford an ambulance." "Shut up," I said. "What happened?" "That fucker stabbed me." So I dialed 911 and relayed our address and reason for emergency. The operator told us to keep applying pressure to the wound on my father's lower back. My dad is a true champ. Even though the sidewalk was just one big puddle of blood, he stayed on his feet until someone thought to run and get him a chair. I ran back and forth along the walkways to get the police and show them the house that George lived in, and then I ran back and forth to get the paramedics. They were so cold and so agonizingly slow. They walked calmly, and I wanted to scream at them to run. I mean, my dad could be bleeding out. Don't they care? I learned later that they don't run because if they do, they'll let their adrenaline kick in, and mistakes can happen. They shoved Caleb out of the way because he refused to let go of my dad's wound and got him packed into the ambulance. I was about to jump on when the police stopped me and told me that I had to stay so that I could give them a statement. My dad shouted at me to call his boss, and I remembered all of his allergies and whatnot for the paramedics. 2 years later, and all of these details have been burned into my brain. I gave my statement to the police, and they made me sit outside the complex on the sidewalk for 2 to 3 hours. They kept me updated on my dad, and once I called his boss, my boss, and answered my stepmom's message, that's when I allowed myself to break down. It felt like I cried forever. One of the cops was nice enough to go into my house and grab my cigarettes and a bottle of water for me. He stayed with me the entire time to make sure I didn't run off or something, but he was really nice to me. He offered to let me sit in his cruiser a few times to get away from the cold. George was waiting in his apartment when they came. When they took him out to where I was, there were 14 cop cars. 14. He still just kept trying to stare at me. I stared right back and felt so much hatred, like I'd never felt before. I wanted to just go over and kill him. My babysitting cop looked over and saw that George was staring, so he used his flashlight to keep George from being able to look at me. Once it was all over, I was allowed to go back to my house where I waited for the information about my dad. I gathered the story from my neighbors while he was in the hospital for 9 days. He had shouted at George to leave his daughter alone, and George had shouted back at him while I was in the house, totally unaware. George said something along the lines of, "Come tell me that to my face like a man." So my dad hopped over the porch and waltzed up to him. The creep had been waiting with a 12-inch blade held to the side of his leg. He struck out with his empty hand and then got my dad in the back with the knife. It missed his kidney very, very narrowly. It travelled up and punctured his lung and damaged his diaphragm. My dad didn't realize that he had been stabbed at first. He got George into a headlock and pummeled the shit out of him, thinking the dude had just punched him in the kidney or something. George dropped the knife, rolled in the grass, and picked up another knife he had been hiding and stabbed my dad again, this time in the upper back. This wound was much more shallow, but still required stitches later. At this point, Shell came outside and screamed to my dad that he was bleeding. He took off his shirt, got pissed, and threw it at George. At that point, the neighborhood stalker put his hands up and went into his apartment. The blood stayed on the pavement until about noon the next day, when my neighbors kindly washed it off for me. I still have pictures in my email of it, as well as my dad's injuries. My dad spent more time in the hospital in critical condition than George spent being held in jail, unfortunately. I feel like it was my fault. I've been addressing that in therapy, but I still feel awful about it, like my dad had to fight my own battle for me. Throughout the week, while I was on my porch or just outside, I had so many women come up to me. They all told me to thank my dad for them. They had all been terrorized by George at some point, and now they were certain that he would be away for good. Several poor women had had George stalk them up to their apartment door and pull his pants down, demanding sex. I still can't believe that the cops couldn't do anything. One of those days, one of my neighbors came up to tell me that the police and neighbors had searched the complex and found that George had stashed many knives all over the place. They were buried in gardens, stuck behind trees, under his doormat, everywhere. I shudder to think that he might have planned to one day grab one of his targets and do something far more sinister than stare. George was declared guilty for battery with a deadly weapon, but the attempted murder charge was dropped. He was out of prison by Christmas on good behavior or whatever. My dad and I have a lifelong restraining order against him. He has never tried to come after me, so I can only hope that he's terrified of my dad now. I wish I could tell you guys that I took self-defense classes and learned to fight the way my dad can, but I'm still a pussy who can't even slap a spider, so there's that. My dad is doing alright now. He's just had his third surgery on Tuesday, trying to repair the damage done to him internally. I'm hoping that this will be the last, and his quality of life will vastly improve. I probably owe my life to my dad. If he hadn't have fought George for me, maybe I would have been the first victim George stabbed. This has left me feeling extremely shook, and I'd love some opinions on this, especially from someone with experience. So, last year, I had a very strange experience in a national forest out in California. I was by myself on a road trip with my dog, and I was driving pretty far into a national forest. I like to camp in national parks and forests because it's kind of isolated, so my dog can roam and they're free of charge. It's a trade-off for sketchy and rough drives into the park sometimes for lack of service and assistance. Anyway, I was driving up this dirt road kind of curling up a mountain around maybe 5 PM I think. It was very nice out, sunny and warm with a slight breeze. Nothing serious happened, but I felt extremely uncomfortable driving into the area, and that feeling just didn't let up. Driving up the mountain, I felt like I shouldn't stay there, and I even texted my boyfriend about it for as long as I could before my phone completely lost service. I was looking for a sign of another person having been around the area lately, but didn't see anything. I pulled over and got out of my car with my dog to look over the edge and noticed a dead squirrel and some broken glass mixed in with the dirt and gravel road. Yuka, my dog, starts growling slightly. She is vocal, but I've almost only ever seen or heard her growl at or with other dogs. I did see her growling at a possum once, so it could have been something that she smelt, maybe. The place continued to make me feel quite on edge, though, but I pride myself on being an independent traveller and backpacker, so I decided to continue at least a bit further with my grumbling pup to see if I could find a good place to camp. As we continue, though, I begin to notice more dead animals. But keep in mind that no one is going to be going more than, say, 5 or 10 miles per hour up this thing, and that's if there's anyone even here. I hear men's voices, and they sound close, and I think I should call out to them, so I stop my car, but then just kind of freeze up and feel like I shouldn't. I can't really make out what they're saying, and I don't see any sign of people anywhere, and I get back into my car and continue to slowly drive forward and cautiously, looking for where the voices could be coming from. Strange thing is, I've never run into other people in a national park or forest when I've gone this deep in. The unsettling feeling grows too about the voices, which have sort of come and gone a few times, and I give up and begin to turn my car around at this point. I honestly don't remember how Yuka was acting on the way down, because I was scared and focused on just getting out of there. I just distinctly remember being surprised at a grumbling when we were standing outside of my car. But kind of dangerously quickly, I went back down the mountain, not seeing any sign of anyone. In the end, I decided to spring for luxury and got a hotel for the night. I figured that I was just fine, and it was just huge and open spaces that can be intimidating, I told myself. And the voices could have just been echoing from somewhere far off, and they just sounded close. Animals die, glass gets broken, nothing happens, cool. But I remember this place, and it sticks with me. Whenever I'm watching scary movies, if I'm walking my dog in the woods at night, nothing compares to the feeling that I had driving up that mountain, and it's honestly kind of interesting to me as well as frightening. But I recently happened across some information as well as some Native American law that made me feel extremely uneasy about the whole thing. So, fast forward a year, and I've mentioned this place to a few people and the haunting vibes it gave me, but nothing much more. I googled the national park once and didn't see anything, but it didn't look much either. I like scary movies and things of that nature, hence my fascination in this little event. So my boyfriend and I were coming up and finishing our road trip just yesterday. We were in Wyoming for a wedding. There were only 2 or 3 hours left and the sun had set, so we decided to listen to some scary podcasts and YouTube videos. We went from the No Sleep podcast to the X-Files and ended up on a True Scary Stories video dealing with Native American lore. I'm kind of half paying attention, just petting my dog, playing Pokemon on an emulator, and I hear the narrator mention Wendigos. It very briefly says what they are and casually mentions that they can mimic voices. I mean it when I see the most horrible chills that I've ever had in my life crawl down my spine, and I stare at my boyfriend and ask him if he remembers that national forest that I was freaked out about last year. He says that he does, and he reminds me that he texted me that I was probably close to a Wendigo, and I look back into that text and he actually did. I also remember him saying that, but didn't know much about their lore and thought that he was just being funny, like, yeah, Bigfoot is probably stalking you or something. And he was like, no, I mean, I was mostly joking, but I said it specifically because you said that you were hearing voices that you couldn't find a trace of. I feel really strange about this, and I start Googling Wendigos and find more information, etc., etc. But they're allegedly able to mimic human voices, and they would live in that sort of area, and it just kind of all matched up. Obviously, there's a ton of questionable info out there, but I tried to find some more reputable websites and authentic experiences. I then specifically looked up missing persons in the area, and the first headline that catches my eyes is another family goes missing. And I went through different websites and news articles of people going missing, but they're all a little hidden underneath national park websites and pictures of trees and whatnot. But I remember looking up the forest about a year ago and didn't see anything, and realized that these stories just didn't seem to be talked about much, which also piqued my intuition. It was stated that well over 100 people in the past 8 years have gone missing and not been found there, on top of many which are just found dead. And the whole thing just has my intuition super spiked. Remembering how unsafe I felt and how much I just wanted to get out of there just terrifies me. And I felt so uneasy about what I was hearing and
still do to this day. My dog and I are very close. She was actually a stray that started following me one day, and I ended up bringing her home from Costa Rica. So her little growls along the way just makes me feel like there was something wrong and more to the whole thing. I've done a lot of solo traveling both in and out of the country, and I have to say that I've never had such a bad feeling, on top of seeing an unnecessary amount of dead animals in a national forest, which just seems strange. I don't think I'll be doing any more solo traveling unless it's around civilization from now on, but does anyone know about authentic Native American lore, or has anyone else had a kind of inexplicable experience like this? Extra points if you've had any bad vibes in national forests from California too. So as a bit of a background here, I'm 21 now and still live at home while trying to get into school and whatnot. This house was brand new when we moved in, just built, so we were the first to live in it. My experiences aren't so much creepy as they are just strange, I think. Or maybe I've just become numb to them or something. Anyway, here it goes. So, my first experience I ever had was when I was 12. I used to have a cable box hooked up to my computer monitor in my bedroom. One night, around 11 PM I'd say, I was woken to my monitor turning on and the TV blaring at max volume. It scared the living hell out of me and my cat too. I jumped out of bed and quickly turned it off, and just as it fell quiet, I heard footsteps in our laundry room and the door to the garage slamming shut. A few days later, I was up in bed reading, and I glanced up to my doorway, and I remember clear as day a pure white face peeking in before casually moving out of view. A few months after this incident, I'd been going into the kitchen one night, again around 11 PM, to grab a late night snack. But for some fucking reason, I decided not to turn any lights on my way there and would just turn on my kitchen lights instead. Well, at the end of the hallway, just before entering the kitchen, I looked to my left towards where our dinner table was, and something was standing there behind the table in the corner. And I shit you not, it looked like someone just standing there with a bedsheet over them or something. I stared for what must have been a solid 10 seconds, calm, and then just casually went to turn on the light. I looked back, and whatever had been there was now gone. After these incidents, things became relatively calm again. I remember small incidences like seeing things out of the corner of my eye. I usually chalked it up to I just wasn't sleeping enough, but everything I thought I saw just felt too real to be imaginary. There had been a night too, around 1 AM I think, when I was in the living room just watching television on the couch, and out of nowhere, there was a loud bang against the window behind the couch. It sounded like a huge bird hit it, which I guess is possible, but at 1 AM that seems pretty unlikely if you ask me. I was too afraid to look and ended up just convincing myself that maybe an owl hit the window or something. After a while, too, things started to go missing. When I was 13, my dad, he woke me up earlier than usual one morning just asking me where my lunch bag went. I told him that it was in the same place as always, the second pocket in my backpack. I got up to check for myself, and it wasn't there. Confused, I just assumed that I left it at school or something and went back to sleep. Around an hour later, that same morning, I checked my bag a second time, and there was my lunch bag, in the same pocket it was supposed to be. Dad swore to me that he never found it, and I believed him honestly, because checking the bag leftovers from yesterday's lunch, they were still in there. But this was one of the strangest things out of all of my experiences, and honestly, I just can't explain it. When I was about 14, I came home from school one day and found that the faucet for the tub had been disassembled and set neatly in a pile on the toilet. I called my dad, and he also swore again that he didn't touch it, and actually ended up blaming me for it. At 15, this one's a little bit funny to be honest. I was taking a shower and noticed the water had gotten significantly colder. There was no way that I'd used up all the hot water yet, so I turned around and saw the handle had been turned to cold. This asshole of a ghost, or whatever it was trying to get me to wash my hair with cold water like I should have in the first place. But now for the two scariest stories that I want to share with you guys. One might not have been paranormal at all, but hey, I'll let you guys decide for yourself. It could have just been an animal, but it was terrifying nonetheless. So, I was 17 at the time, and I've always had a fear of looking out windows at night. I can't explain it. It just kind of terrifies me to my core. But one night, I'd been laying in bed just Skyping my girlfriend when I glanced to my window. My bed is set right against the window, so I'm kind of laying against it almost. One of my blinds was crooked, kind of allowing me to see outside, and when I looked, two eyes, reflective ones, were staring right back at me. My house is a one-story, but my window is way too high off the ground for a raccoon or a possum to just peer through like that. Whatever it was stared at me for a solid 10 seconds before just disappearing. I made my girlfriend Skype with me until I fell asleep for 5 nights after that too, because it honestly just scared the crap out of me. And the most recent event was just last week. It was about 4 in the morning, and I got up to use the bathroom in the hallway. As I was leaving the bathroom, I stopped and looked to my right directly into the kitchen just a few feet away. It took me a second to realize, but something was standing there, and as soon as I realized it, it quickly just walked off. Both my parents were asleep at the time, I can confirm that, and just a few days ago, my girlfriend had been using the bathroom when she texted me asking if I was in the bathroom. The bath is sectioned off by 2 areas, and the toilet and the bath have a door between the sinks. And she swore that she heard a thud on the counter and something being moved around. Anyway, thanks to anyone who listened to this, and I can't explain any of it, and I'm all ears if you guys have any ideas. So a little background before I get to the story. So, my family and I moved into a new house when I was 14. It was newly built, and we were the first to live in it. It was my parents, my sister, and I, and throughout the years, we'd have family get-togethers and parties where everyone has a great time. When I was 15, however, at one of these family get-togethers, I was sitting in the living room with one of my cousins while everyone else was in the dining room or in the front room. The living room is connected to the kitchen, so no matter where you sit, you can always either see the trash can, which it had a flipped lid, or the table. While me and my cousin were just chatting, something caused us both to turn our heads. We saw the trash can's lid flip on its own. We got up to check, confused if anyone had gotten up to throw something away, and no. Everyone was still playing a game or chatting in the same space. We figured that it was the vent above the trash can that made it flip, or something. Neither one of us said anything about it again, but we were both pretty creeped out by it. So we also had a babysitter who would stay with us occasionally because my father was on a tour in Iraq and my mother worked nights. I know it's ridiculous for a 14-year-old to have a babysitter, but my mother felt that it was necessary. Besides, the babysitter was only 5 years older than me, so I enjoyed our talks and time together. She slept in the guest bedroom for a while before I noticed that she started sleeping downstairs. One day, I asked her why she didn't sleep in the room, and her face turned pale, and she quietly asked, "Hey, have you ever had anything weird happen to you in this house?" I looked at her confused, but remembered the trash can incident. I didn't reply though, and she just kept looking at me and then said, "You know, I'm probably going to sound crazy, but I think your guest room has something in it." I continued to look at her, not saying a word, and she continued. "One night, I got up because I felt like something was just wrong, and I went to check on you guys, and you were both sleeping, so I went back to bed. Laying there, I started to notice the statue doll you have on the nightstand was staring at me. Like staring, but I turned around and I started falling back to sleep. and that's when I heard these whispers coming from the vent. I thought it was you guys again, but when I checked, you were both still asleep. She ended the conversation and went to sit on the couch, leaving me there kind of just baffled. But ever since that night, I started getting a bad feeling in my gut. When I was 17, we got a new dog who was a Chihuahua. She slept in my sister's room with her every night, and one night I woke up to my sister just standing over me. And she said to me, "Can I sleep with you? The dog is freaking me out." I couldn't respond as I had just woken up and just kind of scooted over for her. In the morning, however, I asked my sister what had happened. She replied, "Well, I don't know. I was about to go to sleep when the dog sat up from my lap and just started whining and looking at the vent. She started barking, and that's when I took her and just went to your room." Again, I didn't respond. After a couple of days, I was still thinking about it, and it only hit me then about the babysitter that we used to have, when she said, "I heard whispers coming from the vent." I tried to shake it off because a couple of weeks later, my little cousins were spending the night. So on one night, one of them slept in my sister's room and the other, they slept with me in my room. I didn't dare want to sleep in the guest room, so I slept on the floor with my cousins on my bed. Eventually I fall asleep, but my room was pitch black when I woke up in the middle of the night. My doors to my bedroom closet were open as I had gotten out a blanket earlier. I don't know why, but I suddenly started to feel nervous. I kept looking at my closet too, and I had an iDog, which was a robotic dog that you connected to your iPod to do music, and it would play out of the speaker from its back. And depending on what music you played, it showed you its emotions by colors that turned on in the front of its face. Green was happy, yellow was for mellow, and red was for when it was mad. I remember that I hadn't touched it in weeks because it kind of ran out of batteries, and I hadn't gotten new ones, so I just left it on the shelf on the top of my closet. As I was staring into my closet, I started to hear growling, and I saw the iDog's face started to light up red. It barked and moved back and forth, and I reached up to my cousin to wake her up, but she was out of my reach and I was too scared to move. So I just sat there, staring, and finally it stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night that night, and in the morning I threw my iDog in the trash bin. Since then, I've kept my closet doors closed with a rope unless I'm changing clothes or something. But I noticed that there was a vent near the closet too. Now, the reason why I'm sharing this now, having almost forgotten everything, is because recently my boyfriend has been spending the night a lot. I'm 25 now and still living at home while I'm finishing school, and my sister lives in New York for the most part because of school too. My father and mother split up a while back, so he moved out, and my mum goes out a lot with her friends. So it's usually me and my boyfriend alone. My room only has a one-person fit bed, so we sleep in the guest room since my boyfriend likes to take up a lot of space when he moves around at night. One night, my mum was out of town for a weekend trip. I had just gotten out of the bathroom and walked into the room where my boyfriend was examining the vent. When I asked what he was doing, he said, "Hey, I could have sworn that I saw something coming out of this thing, but there's nothing now. Maybe it was just a bug or something? Do you have problems with that sort of thing here?" I must admit that I didn't pay much attention since we decided to just go to sleep right away. But I woke up in the middle of the night because I just had a nightmare, and I actually just recently suffered from PTSD, so it wasn't uncommon lately that I would have night terrors or whatnot. But anywho, I woke up and looked over at my boyfriend who had his back against me and was snoring away. I got up to take some pills and returned to the room. When I did, my boyfriend was standing under the vent. I jokingly said, "What, did the bed bugs come back?" He didn't reply. I then sat on the bed, and the only light that was in the room was coming from the moon from the window. I then said, "Hey babe, come back to bed." but he still didn't reply. Then I said, "Babe, you're starting to freak me out." He turned, confused, like, "Your mum is out of town, right?" I nodded, not knowing where he was going with this, and then he said, "Sorry, I don't mean to scare you, but it's the weirdest thing, but I swear that she was calling for help." "What? What do you mean?" I asked, getting scared. "Well, I heard her yell faintly for help, but it was coming from the vent." We decided that he was probably dreaming in the end, and we just went back to sleep. Well, he did at least. The next weekend, my boyfriend had fallen asleep first, and I stayed up reading. When I finished, I turned off the light and cuddled with my boyfriend. When I was just about to drift off, I could have sworn that I heard my sister call me. I looked up and there was nothing there. I figured it was just... I kept looking, waiting, and then I heard, "Over here." And I'll tell you this much. As soon as I can, I'm moving out of here. So I've had weird experiences my whole life, and to be honest, you'll probably hear more from me on here. But this is the first time that I've told anyone about anything that's happened to me, and this happened a few years ago, and I wanted to share it with you guys to maybe get some answers. So, at the time, I was living with my parents, and I was probably 19 or 20, I think. I had 2 cats that slept in my room during the night, and another detail worth noting is that my room was set up with my bed against the wall across from the door, a dresser at the end of the bed, and the closet was across to the left of the dresser, so the opposite corner of my bed. My ceiling fan had one of those remote controls for the settings and the light too. A super cool feature for me because I hated getting out of bed to turn the lights off and all. Anyway, it was like mid-November, I think, and I don't remember what time it was that I woke up. I just know that it was the middle of the night. I don't know what prompted me to wake up so suddenly, but when I did, I heard a shuffle in my closet. I kept the litter boxes in my closet and the left door slightly cracked for the cats to get in and out, so I assumed that it was just one of them in the closet. When I turned over, my boy was right next to me where he always sleeps, and this made me prop up a little bit to see where my other cat was. I saw her silhouette in the dark, sound asleep at the foot of my bed, and my mind was really tired, and to be honest, I just didn't care for the annoyance of being woken up in the middle of the night, so my head hit the pillow once again. But keep in mind, I've dealt with strange things my whole life, so I didn't think much of the noise in the closet. As I was starting to drift off, though, I heard something slide across the floor from my closet to the end of my bed. The sound could be best described as a stuffed animal or a cat toy sliding across the floor. I glanced over once again to see both cats asleep, and now I began to panic. In the dark, still laying down trying to be as invisible as possible, I felt around for the remote to the light. I quickly found it and pressed the button, and nothing. And then I felt something jump up onto the bed at the foot. It felt about the size of my cat, so it was a small animal or creature-like. Now, what happened in this moment was just so terrifying that I don't even remember what happened with my cats. I'm not sure if they woke up and ran or were just unfazed completely, but this thing moved up my bed. I could feel the pressure and the movement of the sheets around me. I kept pressing the damn light button, but nothing was happening. And then this thing is on top of me all of a sudden, just scratching me. I started screaming, hoping that my parents down the hall would come in and save me, and I'm not sure if my screams were actual words like help or just terrifyingly screaming at the top of my lungs. But the creature felt like it had fur or hair or something. I never actually saw it, and that could have been because I closed my eyes out of fear, or it was just too dark or something, but it started speaking to me. I don't exactly remember the sound of its voice, only that it kept telling me, "It's October." And now, there was obviously confusion added to my terror. I mean, it was November, not October. So was this thing trying to tell me that its name was October or something? Or trying to tell me something about October? I was just too terrified at the time to question anything though, and I just kept screaming. And then, all of a sudden, the scratching just stopped and it just disappeared. I mean, the creature just literally vanished before my eyes. I clicked the button once again and the light finally turned on. I still don't remember where my cats ended up being, and I don't even remember falling back to sleep. But what I do remember is the next morning, and having scratches on my stomach. But here's the even weirder part. When I told my parents about it, and more importantly, questioned why the hell they didn't come running when I was screaming, they said that they never heard me screaming. And my mum told me that she woke up feeling like something was watching her, and she looked up to see these eyes just staring at her from across the room. She explained to me that they looked like owl eyes, and the silhouette was of a small animal type thing. And then my dad told me about a dream that he had about a small furry creature, but I don't remember the rest of what he told me. And I don't know what this creature was or what it wanted, and more importantly, what is the significance of October? Was it a demon, or was it just sleep paralysis? I often question my sanity about this, but both my parents had similar encounters which validated my experience too. Has anyone else had a similar encounter, or does anyone have any info on?
Number 5. This happened about a year ago. I was 22 and in my final year of college. I had been living in a loft apartment that was the 3rd floor of a house. 2 other couples lived in the apartments below me. I lived just off of campus in what's called a cusp neighborhood, which is basically a safer, just more family-orientated area, which was a mix of some college students as well as old people and families. Since my apartment was on the 3rd floor, the door I used was around back with 2 flights of stairs going up to my apartment door. Also, my bedroom was at the front of the house with 2 big windows that faced the street. One night, I was coming back from working on my thesis with a classmate at her apartment. It was late, around midnight, and I drove down my street to find parking. I lived at a cul-de-sac with a dead end, so I turned around when I didn't see parking and decided to park on the main street that ran perpendicular to mine. I had done this many times before and walked to my apartment late at night on multiple occasions and always felt safe. After I got out of the car and pulled my 2 heavy bags out, I noticed a man standing in the street where mine began. He was about 40 feet away and his face was sort of covered by shadow, but he was facing me and I could tell he was staring at me. He seemed to be in his 30s, was wearing regular looking clothing and had a dog that looked to be a kind of beagle next to him. Normally, I would just shrug it off as some guy out walking his dog, no biggie. But I still had one of those really bad gut feelings like something was up with this guy, and here's why. First of all, he pretty much seemed to appear out of nowhere. I had been driving down my street and I didn't see anyone, nor did I see anyone up or down the street I parked on, and I was actively looking around to find a parking space, so I would have seen if someone was walking down the street. Secondly, he was just standing there, facing me. If he were walking his dog, shouldn't he be doing the obvious, like walking? Then the last thing that to me was the creepiest was that he was standing in the middle of the street, not by one of the sidewalks on either side, but smack in the middle, like he was trying to block the street or something. I fumbled for my keys to lock my door and noticed him still standing there, just staring. I knew I had to walk by him to get to my apartment, so I was starting to get pretty creeped out at this point. Not to mention that his dog was just as frozen as he was, not moving and also staring at me. So I sort of half smiled in his direction and said, "Hello," pretty loudly, trying to show confidence in that I wasn't scared of him. I started walking as far to the left of my street as I could, the side that my house was on, making sure my house key was ready to go to unlock my door quickly. My house was 4 houses down from the top of the street, and there's a small street lamp right in front of my neighbour's house that kept it from being totally dark. The man hadn't said anything in return, and I was avoiding eye contact, trying to look straight ahead. Something possessed me to glance at him, and I wish I hadn't. When I looked to my right, he was grinning at me. This really sinister-looking grin. The only thing moving was his head as he followed me. I snapped my head back and increased my speed, trying to mentally locate where my phone was in my bag if I had to call 911. When I got to my house, I turned left to take the little path leading to where my door was and quickly glanced back to see if he was following me. He was directly under my neighbour's street lamp, like a spotlight, about 15 feet from me, just standing there with his frozen dog still staring and still smiling. At this point, I just bolted to my door. It was not well lit by any means, and I couldn't see whether or not he was going to follow me to the door. I unlocked the door as fast as I could, slammed it behind me and deadbolted it shut. I turned off the stair light because I didn't want him to see me through the window at the second floor landing and know which floor I lived on. I fumbled up the stairs to my apartment door, unlocked that and turned off all the lights to my apartment. I crept into my bedroom. Thank God that I had drawn the blinds before I left, and made a little hole in them with my fingers to look outside. Much to my horror, he was standing in the middle of the street again, directly in front of my house, looking up at my window, still smiling, and this time, waving. I freaked out and grabbed my phone from my bag and called my dad. I probably should have called the police in hindsight. I was in hysterics, telling him what was happening. He told me to calm down, make sure all my doors and windows were locked, and call campus PD. I called the campus police, and this time, much more calmly explained my ordeal. By this time, I felt safe enough to look out the window again, and I didn't see him. They eventually came about half an hour later, took my statement, and searched for the guy who, of course, was never found. They did say, however, that there were boot prints in the dirt by my back door, as well as the same prints in the side garden my neighbours who lived in the first floor kept. The garden was on the other side of my house, right under one of their windows. Needless to say, I made sure both of my first and second floor neighbours were warned about this creep. I think the thing that creeps me out the most is that I never saw him actually walk anywhere. It seemed like he just appeared. I never heard footsteps or any indication he had moved closer to me, and every time I saw him, he was just standing there, with his dog who wasn't moving either, not a sound from either of them. That smile still gives me the shivers.
Number 4.
So, I'm a fairly new police officer. out of the military.
All right.
Today